May 26, 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk stretched empty under grey skies, waiting. In London, the British Admiralty began Operation Dynamo, planning to save perhaps 30,000 men from the collapsing front in France. In Paris, French generals watched their British allies prepare to evacuate, and what they saw would strain the alliance to its breaking point. The miracle the British would celebrate looked very different from the French side of the Channel. General Maxime Weygand stood in his headquarters south of Paris, 72 years old, recalled from retirement to command French forces after the German breakthrough. He'd replaced General Gamelin just a week before the evacuation began, inheriting a military situation already beyond saving. Now he watched reports arrive of British troops streaming toward the coast, and his jaw tightened. The British Expeditionary Force, he observed, was abandoning the battle while French armies still fought. Lord Gort, commanding the BEF, had pulled his forces back without coordinating with French command, opening a gap in the line. The Germans had poured through. Now the British were leaving, and Weygand watched the implications unfold like a slow-motion catastrophe. At Dunkirk itself, Admiral Jean Abrial commanded French naval forces and the defense of the port. 59 years old, a career naval officer, he'd been ordered to hold the perimeter while the evacuation proceeded. He established his headquarters in the concrete bunkers beneath Bastion 32, deep underground, coordinating the defense with British Admiral Bertram Ramsay across the Channel. But on the beaches and at the harbour mole, French soldiers began to notice something. British troops were being taken off first. The initial days of the evacuation, May 26 through 28, saw overwhelmingly British soldiers boarding the ships. French units holding the perimeter watched columns of British troops march past them, toward the beaches, toward salvation, while they stayed behind to hold the line. Reports filtered back to French command. Accounts from French officers described the scene, British soldiers filling the vessels while French troops were told to wait, told there would be room later, told to keep fighting. General Robert Fagalde commanded the French 16th Corps, responsible for the western sector of the Dunkirk perimeter. His forces held the line from Berguet to Furnes, facing repeated German assaults. 53 years old, a veteran of the Great War, Fagalde watched his men bleed to keep the corridor open while British soldiers evacuated behind them. His reports to French command grew increasingly pointed. The British, he noted, were saving their own army while French troops provided the shield. In Paris, the French government received these reports with mounting anger. On May 29th, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud confronted the British liaison officers. Where were the French soldiers in this evacuation? Why were British troops being prioritized? The questions were sharp, direct, carrying the weight of an alliance under severe strain. Reynaud pointed out what French generals were reporting. The evacuation appeared to be a British operation, saving British lives, while French forces were left to face capture or death. The British response initially suggested there were practical reasons. British troops were closer to the embarkation points. British ships were taking British soldiers. The organization was complex, but underneath these explanations, French commanders detected something else. The British were getting their army out first, securing their own survival before concerning themselves with their allies. General Blanchard, commanding the French First Army Group, coordinated with Lord Gort from his headquarters. Blanchard had only held this command for a week, thrust into the position after his predecessor, General Billotte, died in a car accident on May 21st. Now he faced the impossible task of managing a collapsing front while watching his British allies prepare to leave. His communications with Gort grew tense. The British general spoke of military necessity, of the need to preserve forces to continue the fight. Blanchard understood military necessity, but he also understood what he was seeing. The British were saving themselves. On the beaches, French soldiers watched the ships come and go. A lieutenant from the 12th Infantry Division, 28 years old, from Normandy, would later describe standing in the dunes as British troops filed past toward the harbor. His unit had been fighting for 3 days straight, holding the western perimeter against German attacks. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, waiting for orders. The orders that came told them to hold their positions. The British troops walking past them toward the ships had different orders. The lieutenant watched a group of British soldiers, maybe 30 of them, reach the beach. Within an hour, a boat had taken them off. His own men, 200 meters away, stayed in their positions. Some asked him when they would evacuate. He had no answer. Reports from the beaches described French soldiers approaching British ships and being turned away, told the vessels were for British troops only, told to wait for French ships that hadn't arrived yet. In London, this news reached Winston Churchill on May 30th. The Prime Minister, in office less than 3 weeks, faced a crisis within a crisis. The military situation was catastrophic enough. Now the alliance itself was fracturing. Churchill understood immediately what was at stake. If the French believed Britain was abandoning them, the entire foundation of the war effort would collapse. France might seek a separate peace with Germany. Britain would stand alone. Churchill acted decisively. On May 31st, he flew to Paris for an emergency session of the Supreme War Council. In a room heavy with tension, with French leaders barely containing their anger, Churchill made a commitment. The evacuation would proceed bras dessous, he declared, using the French phrase. Arm in arm. British and French soldiers would be evacuated equally, in equal numbers, with equal priority. The phrase was calculated, deliberate, designed to signal that Britain valued the alliance above narrow self-interest. Churchill understood he was making a promise that would be difficult to keep. That would mean leaving British soldiers on the beaches while taking French troops. That would be unpopular at home. He made it anyway. The order went out to Dunkirk. British and French forces were to be evacuated in equal proportions. No more British priority. The ships would take whoever reached them, regardless of nationality. Admiral Ramsay adjusted his plans. The Royal Navy would actively evacuate French troops, not just permit it. On the beaches, the change became visible over the next 2 days. French soldiers began boarding British ships in significant numbers. Destroyers that had been taking primarily British troops now filled with French infantry. The small civilian vessels, the famous little ships of Dunkirk, pulled French soldiers from the water alongside British. The evacuation's character shifted, but the shift came late. By May 31st, the majority of the British Expeditionary Force had already been evacuated. Nearly 200,000 British soldiers had been taken off. Perhaps 40,000 French troops had been evacuated, many on French naval vessels to French ports. The perimeter was now held primarily by French forces, with British rear guards. As June began, the evacuation became increasingly a rescue of French soldiers, but the French command noted the timing. Their allies had saved themselves first, then extended help. General Fagald's forces continued holding the western sector. The German attacks intensified. The 12th and 32nd Infantry Divisions fought from positions in Berg, from the canal lines, from hastily prepared strong points in villages and farmhouses. They were buying time measured in hours, each hour allowing more men to reach the ships. Fagaldi's reports described a fighting withdrawal, his units pulling back toward the coast in stages, always maintaining the defensive line, always preventing German breakthrough. At the harbor mole, the long concrete pier extending into the sea, the evacuation reached its peak. Destroyers pulled alongside, taking hundreds of men at a time. The mole hadn't been designed for this purpose, but it proved invaluable, allowing large ships to load directly rather than relying on small boats to ferry men from the beaches. French and British soldiers climbed aboard, often too exhausted to care about nationality, focused only on survival. Admiral Abrial remained in his bunker headquarters, coordinating the defense, even as the perimeter contracted. He was in constant communication with French command, with Admiral Ramsay across the channel, with the units holding the line. The situation reports he received painted a clear picture. The evacuation was succeeding, but at tremendous cost to the French forces providing the shield. His own evacuation was not planned. He intended to stay until the end, to ensure every French soldier who could be saved was saved. On June 1st, the evacuation continued at maximum pace. That day saw over 64,000 men evacuated, the highest single-day total of the operation. French soldiers now comprised the majority of those being taken off. British ships made repeated runs, their crews exhausted but determined. The Royal Navy had committed fully to Churchill's promise. French troops filled the destroyers, the passenger ferries, the fishing boats, the yachts, anything that could float and make the crossing. But on the perimeter, the situation deteriorated. German forces pressed closer. The Luftwaffe attacked relentlessly, bombing the beaches, strafing the columns of men, targeting the ships. Stukas screamed down on the harbor. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Ships were hit, sunk, damaged. The cost of the evacuation mounted with each passing hour. French soldiers in the rear guard knew they were unlikely to be evacuated. The mathematics was simple. Not enough ships, not enough time, too many men. Someone would be left behind. The units holding the furthest positions, the ones in the most exposed sectors, understood their role. They were the sacrifice that allowed others to escape. A sergeant from the 32nd Division, 34 years old, a farmer from Brittany in peacetime, would later describe the moment his unit received orders to hold their position through the night of June 2nd. No mention of evacuation, just hold. They understood what that meant. In Paris, General Weygand received reports of the evacuation's progress. Over 300,000 men saved, the reports indicated. The number was astonishing, far beyond initial expectations. But Weygand's analysis focused on the composition of those saved. The British Expeditionary Force, nearly intact, evacuated. The French forces, partially evacuated, partially captured, partially still fighting in other sectors of France. The British had preserved their army. France had lost divisions it could not replace. Weygand's assessment, documented in military reports and later writings, was harsh. The British, he concluded, had looked to their own survival first. They had withdrawn from the battle at the critical moment, opening the gap that led to catastrophe. They had evacuated their own forces as priority, only changing policy when pressed. The alliance, in Weygand's view, had proven asymmetric when tested. Britain would fight, but Britain would ensure its own survival first. This assessment would color French military thinking for years. The sense that Britain had abandoned France in its moment of greatest need, that the British had saved themselves while French soldiers died covering their retreat, would persist. It was not entirely fair. British forces had fought hard at Dunkirk. British ships had saved French troops. Churchill's commitment had been genuine. But the perception, rooted in those first days of the evacuation when British troops boarded ships while French soldiers held the line, would not fade. On June 3, the evacuation entered its final phase. The perimeter had contracted to a small area around Dunkirk itself. German forces were within artillery range of the beaches. Every ship approaching ran a gauntlet of fire. The Royal Navy made a final effort, sending destroyers in through the night to take off the last troops. French soldiers, many of them from the units that had held the perimeter, finally received orders to evacuate. They pulled back from their positions, moved through the ruined streets of Dunkirk, reached the harbor and beaches. Many made it aboard. Thousands climbed onto British destroyers in those final hours. The ships pulled away, overloaded, sitting low in the water, racing across the channel through darkness. But not everyone could be taken. As dawn approached on June 4th, German forces broke through the final defensive line. The evacuation ended. Admiral Abriel remained in his bunker until German troops arrived. He was captured, along with approximately 40,000 French troops who had held the perimeter until the end. These men, who had made the evacuation possible, would spend the rest of the war in German POW camps. Their sacrifice allowed over 338,000 others to escape, but they themselves did not. The final numbers told the story in stark terms. Of the 338,000 evacuated, approximately 198,000 were British. 139,000 were French. The British had evacuated nearly their entire expeditionary force. The French had evacuated less than half of their forces at Dunkirk, and many of those evacuated to French ports would be back in combat within days, fighting the continuing German advance into France. In London, Churchill addressed Parliament on June 4th, the day the evacuation ended. He spoke of a miracle of deliverance, of the Royal Navy and civilian vessels saving an army, of fighting on the beaches and landing grounds and never surrendering. The speech became immortal, a defining moment of British resolve. In France, the speech was heard differently. The British, having saved their army, spoke of continued resistance. The French army was still fighting on French soil, still bleeding, still dying, with divisions that had not been evacuated, with forces that had no channel to cross to safety. General Fagald, evacuated on June 3rd after ensuring his units pulled back, would later write about the evacuation. His account acknowledged the British effort in the final days, the commitment of the Royal Navy, the bravery of the civilian vessels. But his account also noted the sequence of events. British troops evacuated first, French troops providing cover, policy changing only when French government protested, and even then, many French soldiers left behind. His tone was not one of gratitude, but of grim recognition that in crisis, nations look to their own survival. The French soldiers who were evacuated, particularly those taken to British ports, found themselves in a strange position. They had escaped capture, but they were now in Britain while their country continued fighting without them. Many wanted to return to France immediately to rejoin the battle. The British initially struggled to repatriate them quickly. French troops waited in camps in southern England, frustrated, watching from across the Channel as France fought on. Eventually most were returned, shipped to French ports, sent back to their units. They arrived to find the military situation had deteriorated further. Within weeks, France would seek an armistice. The recriminations within French military circles began even before the armistice. Dunkirk became a focal point for debate about British reliability as an ally. Some French officers argued that Britain had never committed fully to the defense of France, that the BEF had been too small, too cautious, too ready to retreat. Others pointed to Dunkirk as proof that Britain would sacrifice French interests for British survival. The evacuation, which the British celebrated as a miracle, became in French military memory a symbol of abandonment. This was not entirely fair to the British effort. The Royal Navy had performed remarkably, saving far more than anyone thought possible. British ships had evacuated French troops in large numbers once the policy changed. British and French soldiers had fought side by side in the perimeter defense. The civilian vessels that crossed the Channel had shown extraordinary courage. But fairness was not the point. The perception had been established. Britain had saved its army first, then helped France. General Weygand, in his post-war writings, returned repeatedly to Dunkirk. He analyzed the military decisions, the coordination failures, the strategic implications. His conclusion remained consistent. The British withdrawal to Dunkirk and the prioritization of British evacuation had been acts of national self-preservation that came at French expense. He did not argue the British should have sacrificed their army, but he argued that France had learned a lesson about alliances under pressure. When survival is at stake, nations choose themselves. The soldiers who had been left behind the 40,000 captured at Dunkirk, had their own perspective. In POW camps across Germany, French soldiers from the Dunkirk perimeter spent years contemplating what had happened. They had held the line so others could escape. They had done their duty, but they had been left behind while others, including many British troops, had been saved. Some felt betrayed, others simply felt forgotten. A corporal from the 12th Division, captured on June 4th, would write in a letter smuggled from a POW camp, "We held so they could leave. We knew someone had to stay. We did not know it would be us." The French officers who had coordinated with British command during the evacuation had mixed feelings. They had seen the British effort up close, had worked with Admiral Ramsay's staff, had witnessed the commitment of the Royal Navy. They knew the evacuation had been a massive undertaking, that the British had risked much to pull it off. But they had also seen the initial priorities, had experienced the frustration of French troops being turned away from British ships in the early days, had felt the shift only after political pressure from Paris. Their reports reflected this complexity. Appreciation for what was accomplished, but bitterness about how it began. Admiral Abriel, in German captivity, had time to reflect on his role. He had stayed until the end, as ordered, ensuring the evacuation continued until no more ships could come. He had been captured doing his duty, but he wondered if his sacrifice, and the sacrifice of the 40,000 French troops captured with him, had been necessary. If the evacuation had prioritized French troops equally from the start, could more have been saved? If British and French forces had been evacuated in alternating waves from May 26th onward, would the numbers have been different? These questions had no answers, but they lingered. The broader strategic implications of Dunkirk became clear within weeks. France, having lost significant forces either captured or evacuated, faced the continuing German offensive with diminished strength. The British army, largely intact and safely in Britain, was preserved for future operations but was not available to help France in June 1940. The asymmetry was stark. Britain had saved its army and could continue the war. France, having provided the shield for that salvation, faced defeat. On June 22nd, France signed an armistice with Germany. The fighting ended. The French military, which had begun the war as one of the world's premier forces, had been defeated in 6 weeks. Dunkirk had been one moment in that defeat, but it was a moment that crystallized the tensions in the alliance. The British had escaped. The French had not. In the years that followed, as France endured occupation and Britain fought on, the memory of Dunkirk took on different meanings for each nation. For Britain, it was the miracle that allowed survival, the moment when defeat was turned into a foundation for eventual victory. For France, it was more complicated, a moment of abandonment, of Allied betrayal, but also of French sacrifice enabling British survival. Both narratives contain truth. Both missed elements of the other's perspective. The French generals who had watched the evacuation unfold, who had protested the initial British priorities, who had seen their troops left behind while British soldiers escaped, never forgot those days in late May and early June. Their statements, their reports, their post-war writings all reflected a fundamental conclusion. Britain had looked to its own survival first, and France had paid the price for British salvation. Whether this assessment was fair or complete was almost beside the point. It was what they believed, based on what they had witnessed, and it shaped French military thinking about Britain for years to come. General Fagald, who survived the war, would be asked in later years about Dunkirk. His response was measured but pointed. The British saved their army. We helped them do it. Many of us did not survive that help. It was not gratitude. It was not condemnation. It was simply a statement of what had happened, from the perspective of those who had held the line while others escaped. The 338,000 men evacuated from Dunkirk represented a remarkable achievement, a operation that succeeded beyond all expectations. But the breakdown of those numbers, The sequence of who was saved when and the cost paid by those left behind told a more complex story than the simple narrative of miraculous deliverance. It was a story of alliance under pressure, of national interests in conflict, of difficult decisions made in impossible circumstances. What French generals said when Britain saved 300,000 men at Dunkirk was not a simple statement of thanks or anger. It was a complex mixture of appreciation for lives saved, bitterness about priorities revealed, recognition of British effort, and resentment of British self-preservation. It was an acknowledgement that the evacuation had succeeded, but at a cost measured in French soldiers captured, French divisions lost, and French trust in their ally damaged. The miracle of Dunkirk looked different from the French side of the Channel, and the words of French generals reflected that difference. They saw what was saved. They also saw what was sacrificed to save it.